Hello again. None Before Me, Sidney Carroll. John Olney Gresham had time, inclination, and money, enough to be a connoisseur. He also had the correct instinct. He was a born miser. What he kept to himself alone. The privacy of property was his first passion, and possibly his last. His earliest memories did not include a mother, father, sisters, brothers, or even relatives of any proximity whatsoever. He had never had a sweetheart. Now, in his last lonely days, he had neither wife nor kin. He had only his collection, his large house, somewhat on the Baroque brownstone side, and servants. These were old and quiet and capable, never offering, never daring, to speak one unnecessary word to the master. Gresham timed his movement to the heavy gold watch in his pocket, a time for waking, a time for eating, a time for stepping from the dusty tranquility of his den into the abominable traffic of the world, and thence to the little shops where he did his trading, and a time for spending endless hours with his collection. Gresham was a man who had improvised the main strategy of his life, and then stuck ponderously to the stratagem. Connoisseurship had been a whim with him back in the long ago, and he had devoted his life to it. One nameless day in his monotone life, he had seen an ivory figurine in a store window. Its simple symmetry had appealed to him. He had haggled over the price, bought the figurine, taken it home to study it, and he had suddenly become a collector of ivory. That had been the first whim. It had taken him for the first time out of the aimless rich young man's existence into the shops of the town. But once he invaded the shops, he discovered a world far beyond the one he had bargained for. He discovered that ivory is a world unto itself, that as it gets more and more expensive, it gets better and better. Immediately, therefore, Gresham acquired the most expensive piece of ivory carving in the world. Then he discovered that bagging the fox in the first 5 minutes destroys the very purpose, the thrill of the hunt. So the second whim seized him in the form of the one inspiration of his life. Why not? It was such a simple notion after all. Why had it never occurred to anybody else? Why not acquire the best single piece of anything in any line? Ivory was simply one kind of hunting. He had conquered it with one bold stroke. There were still diamonds to collect, and coral, and paintings, and tapestries, and there must be many things. So Gresham started to collect the best of anything in any line. His life was consecrated to it. Thus it was that a certain Mr. Peregrine felt safe in his own mind one day when he called Gresham at the one time of the day when the servants were allowed to answer the phone. "I would speak to Mr. Gresham," said Peregrine, who was a master of, among other things, the archaic speech of his calling. "Whom shall I say is on the telephone?" asked the servant. "Mr. Peregrine, dealer in unusual antiquities." Gresham came to the phone. "Yes, what is it?" "Mr. Gresham, I have for you something, the rarest, the most unusual. There is nothing like it in the entire world." "What is it?" "Mr. Gresham, I would really and truly prefer not to say an item like this. It requires an effect of surprise. It must not be described beforehand." "Bring it up tomorrow at 4. "Mr. Gresham, for this one time you must come to my place. It is a large item. It is delicate. It is not possible to transport it indiscriminately. If it were not necessary, I would not—" "Very well, tomorrow at 4. I'll be at your place." "Thank you, Mr. Gresham." When Gresham got to Peregrine's the next day, promptly, of course, on the stroke of 4, old Peregrine led him into the back room. There it was, on an empire table at which 6 people could eat with comfort. It stood. It was the most magnificent doll's house in the world. It was slightly under 5 feet high. It was the most magnificent doll's house in the world. It was slightly under 5 feet high. Even to an innocent eye, it was obviously perfect. Marvelously perfect in every detail. It was an old European sort of home, almost square, with 4 floors and a gable roof covered with chimneys. A stork in a nest snuggled against one of the chimneys. The entire facade of the house had been swung open on hinges. 18 rooms were thus exposed, and the effect, on the closest scrutiny, was almost frightening in its perfection of detail. The tiny pictures on the walls, the silver service in the dining room, the linens in the closets, the rugs, the mullioned windows, the doors and the doorknobs, all these seemed to mock the perfection of the life-sized world. "The rugs were made by Abuson," said Peregrine. "The little paintings," he pointed at them with a slender gold pencil, "are miniatures by Farragon, Grousse, Watteau, and here, just here, one by Flegy Lebrun, the only miniature she ever painted, worth a fortune in itself, signed. The scale is actually 1/12 actual size. 1 inch equals 1 foot. The house in reality would be approximately 50 feet high, 10 feet to each floor, and another 10 for the roof. Each pane of glass in each window is beveled. Every mirror is in a solid gold frame. Every gold frame is set with precious stones. Notice, please, where I point the pencil, the detail in the wallpaper. It should be examined with a glass. Now take the glassware, crystal, every piece of it. The dishes were made originally for the second child of Marie Antoinette. I have the papers. Now notice the people. And truly the little people in these little rooms were the most astonishing of all. It is a perverse fact that of all the images man continues to make of man, the one which resembles him the least is the one which is intended to resemble him the most, namely the doll. Nobody can make a doll that looks as if it breathes, but the artisan who had fashioned the tiny inhabitants of this extraordinary house had come close to the secret. Small as his creatures were, in the living room on the ground floor, an aged grandmother sat in a rocking chair, with 4 children seated at her feet. The skin of the grandmother's face was veined at the temples. The wrinkles at her eyes had flickering shadows. She held a piece of knitting. Her hands were brown and waxen and bony, and the flesh and the grace of old fingers had been so scrupulously copied that they looked remarkably nimble. You would expect to hear, momentarily, the clicking of the knitting needles. The children around the grandmother, gazing up at her with loving admiration, were unique personalities, each with a different expression on his half-inch face. In an upstairs room, an infant slept in a cradle shaped like a swan. The child slept. It truly slept. Flights of angels were painted on the walls of the room. "Notice the wood paneling," said Peregrine, bending over. But by that time, Peregrine knew there was really no need for him to play the guide on a conducted tour any longer. He had seen the expression on Gresham's face. He knew he had made the sale. "Tell me," said Gresham, trying to stifle his excitement. "This sort of thing, doll houses." "One of the oldest of the arts, Mr. Gresham. One of the most respected. Archaeology shows that in the oldest civilizations, the inhabitants of the earth built dollhouses. Toys. This is the ultimate in toy making. Is there anyone who doubts that toy making is a major art? I wouldn't know, Gresham snapped. It is true, sir, one of the oldest of the arts. And here, before you, the finest specimen ever made. Not the largest, that is obvious, not the most ornate. There are complete models of Fontainebleau in existence, but the finest, beyond any doubt, the finest. How would I know that? I will guarantee it. Written down. All right, I'll buy it. Very good, Mr. Gresham. On one condition. Yes, Mr. Gresham? If I ever find a better one, I want my money back. With pleasure, Mr. Gresham. It was transported with infinite pains to Gresham's house. He had it placed in the den in the very center of the room. The den was a museum to shame museums. It is unfortunate that after Gresham's death, the room was disassembled piece by piece and raffled off to the bidders. The 200 pieces it once contained now grace some 200 dens and museums in 200 parts of the world. The monstrous luxuriance of that room is lost forever. In its original entirety, it was fantastic. Gresham had the world's most expensive pieces of ivory, a diamond in the pier of the Koh-i-Noor, an emerald statuette 4 inches high, a Da Vinci Madonna, a Shakespeare Quattro, and so forth and so forth. The priceless etc. of Gresham's life was arranged in glass cases or leather boxes or under lock and key, and Gresham fondled them one by one every day of his life. He was everything the ideal connoisseur must be, rich man, miser. He was also, and this is important, a great lover. He fondled his pieces with his eyes, his hands, even his lips. Every morning he had flowers distributed through the den. The diamond, the emerald, the ivory gave him all the ecstasy of the blood his fat body could stand. Into the very middle of this inanimate harem, Gresham placed the wonderful doll's house. It was placed upon a sturdy table, so that anybody sitting in front of it had an excellent eye-level view of most of it. Its position in the center of the den was, in its singular way, symbolic. In very little time, the doll's house became the center of Gresham's life. He started by devoting the better part of a whole day to it. He sat in a chair with his hands clasped over his capacious middle, staring at the little objects one by one with placid and puffy eyes. The eyes moved slowly behind the eyeglasses, selecting the single objects to study, then focusing. He sat in the chair until he had memorized the position, the appearance, the personality of every object in the room. He did not touch a thing. On the second day, he began to touch. His short, heavy fingers were not skillful in the ordinary uses of fingers. In a word, he was clumsy. Fortunately, he knew it. He was careful. Delicately as he could, he reached out and felt the texture of the rugs, the surface of the wood paneling on the library walls, the silken edge of a fringe on a beautiful lamp. His pudgy fingers floated through the exquisite rooms like pink balloons. It was enough to frighten the little people. He did not touch them. He did not dare. They were so fragile and so perfect. He shrank from the terrible prospect of harming them in the least degree. On the third day, he began to touch the little people. Now Peregrine counted it the finest day's work of his career when he sold the doll's house. His profits from the deal were enormous. He had wild thoughts that night. Gresham was his client now, his friend. He could sell the absurd old fat man many things now. All a man like Peregrine needs is one such client. Now he could comb the cellars and the collections of the city, the world, and pick the finest and the best, and he could sell it all to Gresham. A man who would spend that kind of money for a doll's house would spend money for anything. Peregrine's dreams ran high that night. He had no inkling of the fact that he had lost for all time the best customer he had ever had. None of the dealers in the city ever knew what happened, least of all Peregrine. Mr. Gresham suddenly stopped buying. Whenever the dealers called the house at the appointed hour, they were politely informed that Mr. Gresham was not in the market for things. Not anymore, thank you. Did that mean forever? Yes, thank you, it meant forever. No, Mr. Gresham was not ill. No, he was not planning a trip. Nobody could understand it, least of all Peregrine. None of them ever had the slightest suspicion of the fact that it was Peregrine who had slain the goose. For the truth of the matter is that when Gresham began to play with his doll's house, he found what he had been looking for all his life. The search of the old orphan was over. Here it was, a real home, and family, and children to do his bidding. The more he played with the doll's house, that fat, ungenerous, niggardly old man, the more he reverted to childhood. He locked the doors of his den, for he wanted no intruding servants to discover him at the game. If a servant happened to discover him fondling a precious stone, it would have caused him no embarrassment, but to have somebody find him playing with dolls would have thrown him into a fit. So he would have his breakfast early, then go upstairs to the den, lock the door, pull the chair up to the doll's house, and begin to play. At first he did it only in the mornings. In the afternoons, after lunch, he would devote himself to the other parts of his collection. But the doll's house drew him more and more. And he became impatient with everything else, like a child who cannot eat lunch in the intensity of his desire to have done and get back to his toys. And soon he gave up with the rest of his collection altogether. He now devoted himself morning, noon, and night to the doll's house. The diamond lay forgotten in its velvet bed. There were no more caresses for the ivory. Gresham's whole life was in the doll's house. When his fingers became more accustomed to the little things, he let his fancy roam. For the first time in his life, Gresham played games. He began to rearrange the furniture, to rehang the pictures, to move the tiny rugs about. He exchanged andirons from the fireplace on the 4th floor with those from a fireplace on the 2nd. But most of all, and best of all, he played with the little people. He moved the children in the parlor so that they all surrounded the grandmother instead of facing her. He liked it that way for a week. Then he put them back again. In the kitchen, a tiny, buxom servant, all in white, stood bending over the wood stove. Gresham moved her so that she stood over the sink instead. He kept her there. The baby in the swan bed he did not touch at all. He liked it where it was, under the lovely flight of angels. There were other people in the other rooms, men and women and children. These he deployed and maneuvered. He became the ultimate in interior decorators. He could arrange the inhabitants of the house, put them and keep them where they looked best to him. In a short time, Gresham began to talk to himself. At least, the servants passing in the hall, passing swiftly and discreetly past the den, hearing his voice making an unaccustomed cooing sound, assumed he was talking to himself. This they did not take amiss. Anything might be expected from Mr. Gresham. Talking to himself in the privacy of his most private chamber was quickly and tactily accepted as simply one more eccentricity. But the truth of the matter was that Gresham was not talking to himself. He was conversing with the little people. "Now," he said, as he tipped the grandmother lightly back in her rocker and made her swing back and forth. "Isn't that comfy?" He sat there, tipping the rocker every time it gave signs of stopping in its arc. Slyly, swiftly, he would lift his eyes from the grandmother in the parlor and aim his glance at the master bedroom. What? Johnny? Mary? Kissing? Soon as my back is turned? With admonishments, he would turn John and Mary back to back. Don't want anybody hurt around here, he would say, slyly. With the children, he was just as solicitous. He soon gave names to each one of them, and he coddled them until they might have been the most spoiled brats in Christendom. Emma, he would say, did you enjoy your lunch today? For he had gotten into the habit of moving the children and their elders into the dining room at meal hours, sitting them in their proper places and changing the plates and removing the silver for every pretended course. He stopped short at serving them food. He stopped short only at serving them food. He preserved his sanity to that extent. At night, however, he moved every one of the little people into beds in the various bedrooms, and in the morning he awakened them with a cheery, "Good morning." 7 weeks of this, and Gresham began to evolve his theory. It was a simple theory. When one comes to examine it in the light of all pertinent facts, it was almost a natural theory. Gresham began to figure that he was God. Why not? He had purchased, for an exorbitant fee, a world of his own. The creatures in it he owned body and soul. Over these creatures he exercised an authority complete, unquestioned, irrevocable. His hand moving among these walls was, why not, the hand of destiny? What is the meaning of destiny? Whatever the words that describe it, in whatever definition, it always has some sweet concern with the future. Then the hand that controls the future, is it not the very hand of destiny? Only in Gresham's brain, only on Gresham's sufferance, did the future of the little people exist. Gresham's pudgy fingers moved through the rooms, arranging furniture and liaisons and lives with the tender mercy of a benevolent God. What was he, then, but God Almighty to this household, this world, this universe of his very own? Thus the theory took shape. Thus it rolled around in his brain, gathering momentum. He drew a picture for himself. He conceived of the world as a series of worlds, one within the other, each with its own god, and the gods growing progressively larger and interlocking, like one of those astounding oriental balls within balls. Gresham was god of the doll's house. Another was god of Gresham's world, and another was god of that god. No, it wasn't so much like an oriental ball. It was more like a telescope. As he sat in his chair, moving his little people backward and forward, upstairs and downstairs, controlling the present and the future of everything and everybody in that house, that world, that universe, he, Gresham, knew that he was God. It added a ticklish pleasure to the game. Now he had a divine scheme. Now he created such a rigid routine for his people that he could not leave the room anymore, except to retire to his bedroom for sleep. He dressed and undressed his creatures twice a day, read solemn bedtime stories to the children, and conversed long hours with the adults. Now Gresham had all his meals sent to the den, and he was impatient with the servants when they took too long laying out the tray for him or picking up the empty dishes after he had hurriedly dined. The moments were precious to him. He had so many things to do for his people. Up to that point, up to the moment of the formation of his theory, Gresham had been a benevolent god. Now, with his catechism set, he began to ponder the ways of all gods, and that started him exercising some of the little extra privileges of his class. After all, a god has to tinker. He began by inflicting certain discomforts, even pain, upon his creatures. One day, he tipped the little grandmother so far back in her chair she fell out and lay in a heap on the floor. "See," Gresham told her, "life isn't all comfy." Now, whenever one of the children was a little perverse in his movements, refusing to stand or sit in quite the manner Gresham had in mind, he took to spanking it. "Let that teach you a lesson," he shouted. "Do as you're told. Conform!" The change from benevolent to vindictive God grew with his growing realization of the absolute power he possessed. Up till now, he had been charmed by his playthings and had acted like a father to an adopted family. Now, when the Father became the Heavenly Father, he indulged himself in his omniscience. When the children weren't looking, he stole toys from the playroom. He hid them in the kitchen. One day he took the knitting needles from the grandmother's hands. "Enough damn knitting," he stormed at her. "Try working for a living, sweat of your brow." He took her rocking chair and all and dumped her in the kitchen. He even attacked the swan crib and the sleeping infant. He knocked the crib over, and the infant came tumbling out, rolling over and over on the floor. "Train 'em young," said Gresham. "Teach 'em life's full of hard knocks." He let the infant lay on the floor for 2 days. He pretended to pay no attention to the wailing sound he heard. They found Gresham later in a pool of blood, his head cracked in places like an egg tapped with a spoon. The glass of the window in the den had been smashed to bits. The theory of the police was that Gresham had climbed to the window sill in order to throw himself out the window. That, being a fat and awkward man, he had bumped into the glass, shattering it. That he had then suffered some sort of attack or had tripped and had fallen over backward on his head. That was the way the police figured it out, but Gresham himself would have told them a different story about what happened that night. He could have told them that he had had an extremely trying day with his flock. Nobody would stand up correctly. The furniture didn't look right. The baby wouldn't go to sleep. "Damn it," he had screamed. "Shut up! All of you! Do as I say, or damn it, you'll roast in hell." In his anger, he kept moving things about with clumsy impatience. Beds, chairs, rugs, pictures, people, and the index finger of his right hand, probing into the far corners of the infant's nursery, felt something it had never felt before. It was high up toward the ceiling in the room, which is why Gresham's eyes and fingers had never found it before. He had never stooped low enough to see the ceilings of the second floor. Now he bent over to look, and when he saw it, he growled. He ripped it from a triangular shelf high up in the corner. It was a tiny religious figure. It might have been a Madonna. He held it in the palm of his hand. It was all green and gold paint over plaster, and there was flower-like calligraphy on the folds of its cloak, and a benign expression upon a face as large as the head of a hat-pin. He held it in his hand for some minutes. Then he had to loosen his tie. Then he held the thing between thumb and index finger, and with one powerful squeeze he crushed it to powder. He flicked it from his fingertips. "Fools!" He rose from his chair and stood face to face with the house. He lifted his right hand clear over his left shoulder. His eyes were terrible. With one stroke of the arm, he could end existence for all of them, then and there. He shuddered, a wrathful god. "No other gods before me," he began. "No!" But the arm came slowly down to his side again. He quivered a little, but he did not strike. He subsided, a forgiving God. That was the night Gresham could not sleep. Jealousy tore at his eyelids, gnawed inside of him. An ancient dyspepsia crept back in and gave him twinges, until he knew he could lie there no longer and simply stare at the ceiling. "Idols," he murmured. "Heathen idols." His pajamas were wet with sweat. Jealousy seeped through his pores. He tossed on the damp sheets until he could stand it no more. He rose from the bed and strode with mighty steps out of the bedroom, into the hallway, into the den. It was a dark night. No moonlight came through the windows. It was late, the blackest late part of night. He wanted no light for what he was about to do, so he did not turn on the switch. It took him minutes for his eyes to see through the darkness. The first thing they saw, of course, was the doll's house. He walked noiselessly, with a fat man's grace up to it. "I gave you life," he said in an even voice. "Now." Once more he raised his heavy right arm over his left shoulder. He raised himself on his toes. This time he brought the back of his hand down against the house with all his strength, and what occurred first was the splintering of the wood where his hand hit. A split-second sound of splintering. The blow swept the whole marvelous house off the table, and it fell to the floor with a great crash. It was no sturdy framework that held that house together. Too precise it was, and too delicate to be that strong. The framework caved in like glass. In a heap, then, at Gresham's feet, lay a shattered mass of splinters, and bits of glass, and the irreplaceable furniture, and the little people, and torn pieces of the incomparable wallpaper, all in a rubble, like the rubble after a bombing. "You fools!" Gresham shouted. It was the back of Gresham's hand that had smote the building. Now the knuckles were bleeding. The hand was at his side, and the blood dripped to the floor. "You fools!" he shouted. "Never heard of a day of judgment? Wouldn't believe me when I warned you? The power of life is the power of death. I warned you." He raised the wounded hand and looked at it. The blood ran down his forearm. "Wash you in the blood. I'll wash you in the blood, you stupid, selfish, disobedient people!" He stood over the rubble and shouted and exulted and sweated. God, even a god, cannot be entirely calm after producing an earthquake. Gresham could not keep his arms from shaking, but he knew he could go to sleep now. The evildoers had been slaughtered. Vengeance had been wrought. But first he walked to the window. First he wanted, for some strange reason, to look at the night sky. He walked to the window and leaned heavily against the sill. He was still breathing hard. His throat and his brain felt curiously congested. He climbed up on the sill, on the broad sill, as if, by getting closer to the window, he could suck in more air. He stood there on the sill, leaning his full weight against the window, panting hard. He looked up at the sky. It was the faintest pale blue of the very early dawn. Not a single cloud floated up there, nothing, till Gresham saw, from the immense void covering half of the shoulder of the sky, the back of an enormous hand was coming down at him, swiftly, powerfully, vengefully. The end. Yarud.